about the political response to technological change. Now, public policy has always been behind the enterprise of private actors. So right now, people are going to be kind of really shaping within the nature of what policies come to respond to the fourth industrial revolution. And to discuss that, we have a great panel. Can I bring up to the stage? I'm Tom from IPPR, I'm Paul from CrowdPac, I'm Flossie from Forum 280, and Gary from IDEA, or the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. So I guess that the first question is, what do you make of the response so far from people who do politics to the fourth industrial revolution? And I'll start my left.
Well, so I think the first thing to understand is that this is not static in politics itself. So to some extent, the quality of the response from politics will depend on how much technology disrupts politics itself. So this idea that the disruption only exists in the economy and society and therefore politics is therefore just reacting to technology, I think is fundamentally mistaken. So the capacity of politics to respond will depend on how much politics itself is disrupted. So I think what's quite interesting is that if you look at the economy as a whole, what we're seeing from technology is this great concentration of power. So there's a huge amount of power concentrated in a small number of firms like Amazon, Google, Facebook, Apple. In politics, you've actually had an incredible concentration of power in a small number of political parties and a small number of media outlets. And what's now happening is actually technology is disrupting those existing concentrations of power in politics, opening it up like it hasn't been opened up ever before. The mainstream media doesn't have a lock on all of public opinion and source of information anymore. That's fragmenting, that's breaking down. So actually, the real question is, how much will politics be disrupted? And in that disruption, will that actually enable it to respond to the disruptions we're seeing in the economy and society?
I mean, on that point then, as how much politics is being disrupted, I mean, you might argue that Trump, to some extent with Brexit, these are a response of kind of fragmentations of algorithms directing people to the news that suits their particular agenda. You're seeing kind of the fracturing of public information. Would you consider that to be a disruption? Anybody here? I know, Flossie, you worked briefly in politics. I mean, what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, so I worked on the Hillary Clinton campaign last year for my sins. I think kind of to the original point about where politics is kind of meeting these technological changes, there's sort of two parts to that. In the actual, so in my experience in the campaign, the technology that was being used was minimal and quite dated, but was being heralded as a kind of, it's really exciting, we've got this database that can automatically search our voters, and it's like, yeah, I mean, that's quite helpful, it saves me time. But actually, some of the sort of real technological advances in terms of disrupting how the political system operates, I think the start of it is there. So the campaigns are they're very traditionally organised. You have central hubs, people come there, they get given pieces of paper and they go out and knock doors. The Bernie campaign had a bit more sort of young hackers working on it. They had some interesting tech that came out of that. They're building this thing where sounds obvious, but you have an app on your phone that means that anywhere you are in the country, you can open it up, you can see what kind of issues are pertinent to that region, you can go and knock some doors and record it all in your app. So you can kind of move away from this traditional organising structure, which I think goes to some points made earlier about how technology has the sort of capacity to empower and kind of amplify kind of individual voices like that. But equally, it does show that current politics is just not kind of dealing with the current issues that are coming through at the moment. And I think that's where so Forum 280, the organisation that I've been involved with, is a California-based non-profit, and their mission statement is to bring kind of entrepreneurial and innovative thinking from Silicon Valley to the world's greatest problems. So precisely this point of trying to combine policy entrepreneurship and technology entrepreneurship. And our latest project, which Alvin actually came to last week, was in Reykjavik in Iceland, and it's all about this fourth industrial revolution, the impact it's having on jobs, how can we create measurable, actionable solutions that the key point here is that we then bring to politics. We then bring them to the politicians slightly more fully formed and say, hey, look, we've been working on this in this community, it's doing this, maybe it involves a huge amount of technology, maybe it involves a small amount, but it's working. And I think that might be the way to kind of bring politicians in a quicker way.
But I mean, particularly the idea that you raised earlier of politics, or certainly the spaces that we'll use for politics happening, like Westminster, policymakers responding to technology change that you feel like if they're disrupted, then they will respond. And certainly within news, we respond to very much the agenda set in Parliament, and very rarely do we ever hear much politicians really talking about issues around technical change or some of the things that are going to be happening. And I feel like how then do we begin to see politics become disrupted by technology? Where have we seen adequate enough disruption enough to trigger that conversation?
I think one of the main ways we need to disrupt politics, and apologies, a lot of my kind of experience in this comes from the States, but I think we're talking on a sort of global level here, is the financial aspect of politics. And it was touched upon in terms of the distributions of wealth and all that kind of thing. Like, if you can find systems that disrupt the financial underpinnings of the political system, which technology has obviously many possibilities to do, then I think like through that route you can see the disruption of all sorts of other levels of the process that can open up the conversation.
Yeah, so I run a political crowdfunding platform called CrowdPac, which does try to disrupt the way in which money works in politics, and a few of the other aspects of the political system and selection process, and making it easier for people to explore runs for office and get into politics, making it easier for new movements to grow. I've been involved in building movements like the BAS and platforms like Change.org in the past. And I think there's a lot of green shoots of the new kinds of 21st century political practice emerging. I would say, after doing this for 15 years or so in one way or another, I continue to be frustrated at the slow pace of renewal in the political arena. A lot of it has stayed in the domain of experiment. There are both in terms of the practice of politics and mobilisation, and in terms of the practice of democracy and some of the digital democracy experiments that Jeff was talking about and Esther have been involved in around Europe, I think are very exciting. But I still feel like politics as a whole is really in the phase now of reacting to what we call the Fourth Industrial Revolution rather than responding to it. Let me tell a very short story. I spent some time with the Sanders campaign last year in the States, went around a bunch of different primary states with them, and I do think that they were doing a lot of really innovative stuff in terms of the practice of politics, empowering people in a decentralized way. The Macron campaign did some similar stuff actually with a different political agenda, really empowering people on the front line to go and do stuff. But then, what about the agenda itself? And I had this fascinating conversation, which has stayed with me ever since, with a young man in Colorado who looked squarer than most of the Bernie people at the Victory Party in Colorado. I thought, this is interesting, I'll chat to this guy. And so I said, where do you come from? And it turned out that he was a robotics engineer, and he built robots which build wind turbines. So, building wind turbines is supposedly one of the great sources of new jobs for unskilled workers or manual workers. And he visited the factory with the workers who he was putting out of work, and clearly thought deeply about this, was very troubled about it. And I said, so how does that experience and that anxiety about the pace of change and the threats which are emerging in society, how does that relate to your support for Bernie Sanders, who, as far as I know, hasn't really talked about automation? And he said it's about the ethics, it's about the morals. I basically trust him more than anybody else to face up to this unflinchingly and to wrestle with the issue. So I think there's something about, in politics, being prepared to face the scale of the challenge, and not just to stay in the incremental phase of politics, which we've been in really since, I think, the early 1980s in most of the world, the sort of low expectations, laissez-faire phase, and actually face up to the fact that with the velocity of change that we're looking at, we really do need bigger, bolder solutions, and it's possible then to get things very wrong. And I would say again, go back and look at the final ad which Donald Trump ran. There is a robot in that ad. It's not all about Mexicans and Chinese people. There's a robot there, and there is a kind of very bad way of responding to some of these challenges, and there are also all sorts of cul-de-sacs. But I think there's something about the scale of political ambition which is required at this moment, as well as a transformation in political practice, to empower the many and not the few, to use a loaded phrase.
Tom, do you think that's accurate? Is that an accurate depiction of what's happening? Sorry. Yeah, Tom. Yeah,
It's Gary.
Gary.
Sorry. So I sort of see two strands of technological engagement from political parties. We run something called Democracy Labs, which enables political parties around the world to look at how they can use technology to solve issues usually related to engaging with their members and the electorate. And this is a theme. It's also outside the West. We run it in Georgia, in Colombia. There's good cases in Argentina. That's sort of the one element of it, where technology parties are sort of realizing that they need to engage with the voters differently. But the other side of it is that, as Jeff said in his keynote, there is a deficit of leadership in actually articulating a coherent political vision on what all this means for societal and economic change. And that's so far I haven't seen that anywhere in the world where a politician or party leader has been able to say that. I think that'll be the sort of the golden egg in a way.
Yeah.
That if someone comes up with that, then they're able to really capture the zeitgeist and win elections. And if I may add, I think we're seeing the flip side of it. I mean, there's a huge rise in Western Europe. Sort of far-right populism has been on the rise since the 1970s, quite steadily. And I feel that it's a response to there being a lack of vision about the future of the economy. It's people being quite scared about where their jobs are going to be. And if we let them fill that vacuum, then I don't think that very constructive things are going to matter, because the response is going to be to isolate and to make things smaller. But we need that sort of crystal clear political vision about the future.
Well, so I think there's a little bit of a danger in all this with getting somewhat carried away. So there is something about, it's the people who are doing well who are thinking about the future. And that's the kind of people in this room. The people who are not thinking and worrying about the robots are the people who, across the UK, in the last 10 years, have seen no improvement in their wages. So everyone said, well, it's a shocking result of people voting to leave the European Union. Well, actually, given that you said, would you like to vote in favour of the status quo, which you have seen no improvements outside London and the South East, per capita output hasn't returned to its 2007 level in a single region or nation of the country outside London and the South East, right? And saying, okay, you haven't had a pay rise for 10 years, your public services have got significantly worse, and you can't see the route to it getting better, then would you like to vote in favour of this current state of affairs or against it? And people chose to vote against it. I think if you look at Britain's productivity problems, the problem is not that we've got too many robots taking away all the jobs. The problem is that we've got too few. Right? Our productivity has flatlined for a decade. It's gone absolutely nowhere. So we can get a little bit distracted by this idea that the mass of people want us to solve a problem that hasn't arrived yet. They'd like us to solve the state of the country right now, where they're waiting in line in A&E departments, where they're going to food banks, where they're working 3 jobs, where you're more likely to be in poverty and in work rather than out of work and in poverty. And I think people want us to try and say, well, actually, how can we use some of these technological solutions to solve today's problems and not just think about the future? My second point is just very briefly on this: when will the political earthquake come? You're in it right now. Anyone who thinks this is about to come needs to look back at what happened in the general election earlier this year. Right? The political earthquake was that for the first time, non-voters came out in huge volumes and voted. And no one knew that was going to happen, because on all the party databases and all the party lists, they just didn't detect it. So the revolution happened when a whole group of people in society who had been politically disengaged became engaged for the first time. The second revolution was that young people, who we were all told would never vote, came out and voted for the first time. Now, the political consequence of that is that for the first time, the politicians are trying to figure out, well, what's the answer? What's the response? So it's actually going on in real time, this revolution in politics. It's not some way into the future. It's happening right now. And the question is, can you harness that energy and turn it into a real force for good and for the real transformation of society so it becomes fairer and more equitable and gives people a sense of hope for the future. But there is something about, you know, you have to be in a pretty comfortable position to think all the problems are in the future. The problems are in the present right now, and technology is reshaping the politics of today, not just the politics of tomorrow.
I mean, I feel like a lot of people are vaguely aware of this, but then when you say that people want their conditions right now to be met, they want technology to be harnessed for them, none of those demands happen. You have to ask for it, you have to fight for it, there have to be actors acting on your behalf to make that happen. So where is any of that?
That is what is so interesting, is that the way that technology is currently working is you get these rushes of opinion that form very, very quickly and very, very fleetingly, and then they dissipate away again. And you see this a bit with, for instance, the expansion of the Labour Party membership, where you've got a huge number of new members, but the number of activists is not up to the same degree that the number of members is up. So the question, in a way, is that technology has enabled people to come around a particular issue or point of view. How do you get that to then actually turn into a systemic force that can actually deliver a change over time? And we haven't cracked that yet. The good news is, at least, that there's some disruption, right? I find it fascinating. You look back at decades of data about British social attitudes. We are a much more progressive country than our politics would suggest. The things that British people value are working together, taking care of one another, good hospitals, good schools, great education for everyone throughout their lives. People have actually pretty progressive positions in this country. And for a generation, our politics has taken it in a completely different direction. So I'm actually quite excited about the possibilities of technology to disrupt politics, precisely because I actually think the better angels of people's nature will eventually come to the fore. And you know, the price that we're paying at the moment is some Twitter trolling and some unpleasantness Jeff talked about, amplifying the kind of negative aspects of human nature. That's true, but that also means that, to me, there's sort of everything to play for.
I agree with a lot of that. I think we are in a sort of revolutionary moment in politics, and there's huge opportunity in that. There's also a huge amount of noise and sound and fury and turbulence. Revolutionary moments don't always lead to positive outcomes. I wrote something in Prospect earlier this year which drew a glancing analogy between this moment and 1989 in terms of the scale, and I continue to believe that there's a huge transformation now taking place in the West in terms of the order of the system and where we're at. Now, you know, the revolution in 1989, which everyone was so excited about, you look at the decisions that were taken and not taken, and the organising that took place and didn't take place, you know, effectively what you had for Russia and most of the former Soviet states was, I think, a tremendous decline in their politics. You can argue about whether it is worse now or whether it was worse in 1989, but certainly if you compare that process that took place during the 80s with the process that's taking place now, I would argue that we're in a much worse place in Russian politics. So, you know, let's not be sanguine about this moment. A revolutionary moment does not necessarily lead to progress. It's about how people take hold of that and what they do with it. I think that there's a lot of people, you know, we did crowdfunding for Momentum, and for other people on the left in the recent election. I wasn't as surprised as lots of people by its outcome, and I think that there are two things I want to say about it. One is I still think that was a reaction rather than a really positive response to the challenge of the future. It's a reaction to the past in the way you described. All sorts of problems stored up. The question is how you connect those frustrations of the past to the transformations of the future. I do think that there are some very rich conversations starting to happen around the fringes of politics about how you might reshape, ownership and democratize capital and intellectual property. You know, the velocity of innovation is increasing. Should the duration of intellectual property lockdowns decrease, or should commons be growing more rapidly? I think we need to start having some of these fundamental conversations. I think there are people right across society, including in business and places like DeepMind, where my wife used to work, who are up for those conversations. My concern right now is I don't see them connecting the right way. I don't see the kind of radical transforming energies in politics connecting with the radical transforming vanguard of technical innovation and commercial innovation, or indeed social innovation. These things aren't cross-fertilizing and things aren't going to scale fast enough. And that's really the project of the next 10 years.
Do you feel like the current political actors who dominate traditional space where politics happens, parties, big tanks like yours, unions, are they just completely irrelevant to this particular challenge right now, which is the fourth industrial revolution? I mean, I get IPPR press releases all the time, and very rarely, out of all of the mass that come, do they ever particularly grapple with fourth industrial revolution. Sometimes, but as a percentage, it's quite minute, and you're a major think tank. So when you think about the whole space, everybody basically culpable right now.
I won't make him respond to that initially, but I will say I think what you've seen from IPPR, particularly in the last few months, is a lot more grappling with that stuff. I think most of the institutions are stuck in the 90s, to be honest with you. I think the political parties, and you're seeing some of this in the current headlines, it's appalling stuff about abuse of power. It's really a symptom of the way in which those institutions are broken, really deeply broken and not fit for purpose.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's basically wrong. I would encourage you to pay a bit more attention. So we have our Commission on Economic Justice, right? And on the commission, one of our commissioners is Mustafa Suleiman, who's one of the founders of DeepMind. We're doing enormous amounts of research on automation, on artificial intelligence, on the whole agenda of the fourth industrial revolution. If you read our interim report of the commission, in fact, had an entire chapter that was about the future, about the 2020s and how automation and technology was going to reshape society. So I think this is part of the issue, is that it is taking some institutions a while to catch up, but partly people develop mental shortcuts where they sort of assume that none of this is happening. So I would also say, for example, if you look at some of the stuff that the current Labour Party is doing, it's more interesting than it's been given credit for. Right? The paper on alternative models of ownership started to reach towards a new and different agenda. Is it there yet? Absolutely not. Is it heading towards the direction to grapple in these things? I think they are, but there is something about if our personal shortcuts in this world of 160 characters always tell us that by default none of the political institutions are responding at all in any way, shape or form, then I think that's a mistake. Jürgen Meyer, who's the CEO of Siemens, he's also one of our commissioners on the Commission on Economic Justice, and he just published an incredible piece of work on digitization. And that piece of work on digitalization of the economy talks about how you could get the growth rate up. It talks about how you could distribute those gains across the whole country, how there was a really big opportunity of connecting digital and manufacturing. So there is thinking underway there. It's just that also in a world of responding to tweets, people also have to take the time to look for where is the new thinking actually taking place.
I could just touch on that as well. So I think 2 points. One, on the traditional political parties, and we've sort of talked about it a little bit, it's trying to lift the discussion from that 5-year election cycle, which we need to step back from, and we need to be having a discussion in a much more planned out sense in the next 20, 30 years. What do we think is going to be happening? And how can we get this away from the kind of boring of party politics? And it's kind of an interesting space in some ways, because the political parties at the moment, they're not quite well versed in this enough to have really strong partisan opinions on something like the effects of AI, partly because they're not quite up to speed on it. So there's actually an interesting conversation to be had there to try and pull the importance of this slightly away from the mudslinging that you get in the kind of election to election cycle political arena. And the second point is on unions, I think are a really important part of the conversation. I think so. The work that we're doing at Summit Ahead keeps touching on. We're back to these really fundamental questions that have been there in previous industrial revolutions. We're back to workers' rights conversations. We're back to unionisation conversations. We're back to network labour markets, how people are finding opportunities, how people are getting continuously trained, and how are people who are existing as individual kind of self-employed workers, how can we connect them to other people? I think a kind of revived union movement of some kind could be vital in this going forward.
I just want to say, in terms of, you mentioned the political earthquake element. I mean, in the last UK general election this year, the two biggest parties combined got much a higher percentage of the vote than in quite a long time. And what we need to do is look across the English Channel to France, where a new party was created out of nowhere with none of the structures that traditional political parties had and swept into power. And in a way, it's a part of it perhaps redefining the ideological spectrum. Macron seemed to say that it wasn't left or right, and he wanted to listen to people more. And I think if we look at the Brexit referendum, it was quite clear that there's that showed a very different kind of ideological spectrum in place. David Goodhart used the term somewheres versus anywheres as people. I mean, it's a multifaceted sort of field, but I think that we have to, in terms of a political earthquake, we have to look at how some of the traditional parties are sort of collapsing around Europe.
Yeah, but the political earthquake that I'm pointing to is not looking at Jeremy Corbyn or the Labour Party or that result. The political earthquake is that the people that we were told never vote, the non-voters and young people, we were told these two groups never vote. And the political earthquake was that they did. And why did they come out in such great force? In part, it's because actually they were energized by completely new channels of information and organization, whether that was the 5 or 6 million times that videos and news stories were shared on Facebook or huge participation on Twitter. And that is the political earthquake, that there is a new force in British politics that the political parties now have to respond to and will reshape them. Because their priorities won't just be how do you give another fund to people over the age of 65, because they're always the people that vote.
How do you translate that though into demands for fourth industrial revolution and demands for, I don't know, if you're a collective, if you're in an area where majority of your jobs are facing eradication in a few years' time, how does that translate down to these people organising to get more from technical change?
I think you've got an interesting political constituency coming through from that group who are very more well versed technologically, generally, they've grown up with this kind of technology, are probably more able therefore to learn some of the more incremental changes as they go, and also are kind of expecting something different out of their careers, which I think can map down through different social strata. So even if you're talking about the kind of most well-educated, wealthiest group of these young people who are kind of the anywheres rather than the somewheres, there's still aspects of the way that they view their careers and what they want from continuous training and maybe unionisation because they're a freelancer and they want to work in a different way that can trickle down to the somewheres and that can create this broader political constituency for some of this change that needs to come about if we're going to tackle this properly.
I think one of the challenges is that nobody has yet turned the issues of the fourth industrial revolution into something which is like a kind of a white-hot political agenda, which is relevant. People feel is relevant to their lives, and which is salient, which is it reaches that level of salience that the NHS is at, that Brexit has been at, and that's partly because this stuff is new and unfamiliar to people, and maybe feels a little bit distant in the way that the threat of climate change feels a little bit distant, and maybe you can't expect that to be. But I think there is I think that the moment, this moment of crisis that we're in right now is the combination of the crisis of the past and the coming crisis of the future. And that that there's something about the crisis of inequality which has become very salient over the last 5, 6, 7 years, which can combine those two. If you start to tell a story of hope about how you can narrow the gap, the inequality gap, rather than it continuing to widen and widen, and connect that to the issues of the fourth industrial revolution, then I think that starts to get interesting.
I guess this is what I'm interested in, because the public is a broad group. Largely, they don't follow complicated narratives. They follow simpler narratives, like, for example, some people thought robots should pay taxes because they earn more than us. Maybe that might be easy. Or democratize Facebook. We all on Facebook. Let's turn it into a state until we get a vote. Let's get rid of the kind of ownership model. I mean, I don't know, it's like, I feel like there needs to be, what then becomes the narrative then to engage people in making demands on this?
It's the narrative that there always was, which is about power.
Yeah.
Right? And I think again it is happening. So I don't know how we've had collective amnesia in this room, but the Mayor of London actually withdrew the operating license from Uber, right? And that is a very concrete example of this entering into politics right now. A year ago, I wrote an article saying these apps and platforms, if they didn't change the way that they behaved, they would end up having their license to operate withdrawn. It's an entirely predictable outcome in advance. If you look at Airbnb massively shifted its behaviour from saying enforcement of overuse of short-term rentals was entirely a problem for local authorities and nothing to do with Airbnb. They shifted their position and they now enforce the council regulations on the council's behalf, and they moved the burden of proof onto the homeowner renting out the home to prove to Airbnb that they've got permission, right? So they complete turnabout in their position. Uber kept saying, screw you, we'll behave however we want to behave, we're a global company, we'll be exactly the same in every city, and it lost its license to operate. So the politics of it is emerging in a very concrete and tangible way. There's absolutely no reason, for example, with Uber, that you couldn't have a very successful business that didn't decide that it had to, take advantage of its workers and not respond properly to complaints and behave, pretty atrociously. That isn't actually necessary in having a taxi app that connects people who want to take taxis and people offering taxi services.
Like necessarily all those in our public domain, from long-standing challenges of inequality in political economy and abuses of power and corruption to the challenge of the future, like the fourth industrial revolution. Actually, having those arguments, what I think we haven't yet figured out is how to have those arguments in a more constructive way, because still it feels to me like it gets to the media, it gets to the kind of the world of official politics. It turns into more sound and fury than actual wisdom. And I think that's the challenge for us over the coming period. Jeff wrote something very good on around the idea of collective intelligence. How do you combine artificial intelligence with democracy, basically? And I think that this idea of collective intelligence is one of our biggest challenges. Take it even beyond the question of AI. Like, how do we achieve collective democratic intelligence to solve some of these big problems that we're faced with right now?
Okay, that's a great place to end it. Do we have time to open up the floor?
We don't, unfortunately, because lunch has been served. That's exciting.
I mean, food is better than questions, to be fair.
So, round of applause for the panel, then.